Welcome to the Business Standard Show, Mr. Sinha. I'll begin by asking you why you think this budget is incomplete. At a post-budget discussion, you called it an incomplete budget.
Yeah, so why do I think it's an incomplete budget? You see, every budget has a context. It has a given set of challenges. And in the budget, which is only an annual feature, because you will get, if you continue in government, another chance, you will present another budget. So has the finance minister taken into account all the challenges that we are facing currently and which should have been dealt with in the budget? I'll take a minute of your time to point out which are the challenges to my mind. The first, of course, is COVID. We all know that COVID is not yet gone, and government keeps reminding us that we have to be very careful, use your mask and social distancing. And so COVID is looming large in the background. The second is, I would say, agriculture. The 3 laws have been taken back. The farmers' agitation has been called off. But the issue of MSP remains, and the farmers can be on the war path at any given point of time. And I'll come back to agriculture a little later, but I'm saying that agriculture is a major issue. Then a very important issue is unemployment, which is at a record high. And this was demonstrated when we saw what happened to the railway recruitment, where 1 million people applied for about 30,000 jobs. So unemployment is a very major issue. Then we have inflation, which is creating problems for the common man as well as for the economy. Then we have the issue of distress in the MSME sector. Then a very important point to my mind, to which I found that very little reference has been made by the commentators also, is the declining rate of domestic savings and domestic investment, or investment generally, including foreign investment. And then there is the issue of rising inequality in our society, which is a very major issue to my mind. And if it's not tackled in time, then it's going to lead to all kinds of social unrest. So these are the 7 challenges that we are facing at the moment. And we have to understand how the budget has dealt with these 7 challenges. I would say that there have been some references to some of these, but there is no reference to many of these issues in the budget. So that's why I felt that it was an incomplete budget.
But don't you think the capital expenditure push will, in some ways bring the economy back on tracks? It will also attract more investments from maybe the industry.
You are absolutely right. And I expected this question from you, because the highlight of the budget has been projected to be this very significant increase in capital expenditure. Good thing. It's a good thing that the government will spend its money on various productive measures. But there are, stages. One is you have made the allocation. The second is, where are the projects on which these allocations will be spent? Are they ready to take off? When will they take off? These are questions which will have to be tackled as we go along. But the more important issue to my mind is that, I refer to the domestic savings and investment rate. Now, to give you the information, domestic savings have come down from a high, I'm looking at a 10-year span, from a high of around 37, 38% of the GDP to around 31% of the GDP. And if you're talking in terms of GDP, then it's a gap of about 6%. 6% of the GDP, according to the calculations today, will amount to about 15 lakh crore. Now, this is something which is not there in our economy today for investment. Maybe our domestic investment, domestic saving rate should have touched 40. I mean, you are aware, I'm aware that in China, for instance, or all economies which have progressed in the past, the important thing has been domestic savings.
Right.
So it is very important that we look at domestic savings. Domestic savings have been falling consistently. And as I said, we are looking at a gap of something like 15 lakh crore. Now, compared to last year, the increase is what? 2.5 lakh crore in capital expenditure in the government's budget. So what does it mean? Where is 2.5 lakhs compared to the overall decline of money in our economy?
As a former FM, how would you have presented this budget? What would the theme have been, hypothetically speaking, at this time of pandemic? What would have been the theme if you were the FM?
You see, I must remind you that when I was FM, and I presented my first budget in 1998, India was faced with multiple crises. And the most important was the crisis of confidence in Indian economy because of the nuclear tests and the sanctions which had been imposed on us, which had completely ruined sentiment. And as you are aware, a modern economy runs on the basis of sentiment also. And we had to pull the economy back from the brink to a higher growth path. But now, what did I do? And that brings me to a very important question of investment and the sequencing of investment. And this is what I did. It was not merely the amount of investment, both public and private, which we were trying to push in the economy. It was also very importantly the sequencing of that investment. Now, government can spend its money and create consumption demand. But I did not fall for that. I went for what is generally described as investment demand. And therefore, we started, as you're aware, all those projects like the national highway projects or rural roads. Golden Quadrilateral, rural roads, Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. And then I gave tremendous incentive to housing. And it remains one of those uncelebrated chapters of our economy that the housing picked up. In fact, the entire real estate sector picked up, but housing picked up in particular. And I was reading somewhere that the age at which young people acquired a residence came down from something like 40, 45 to 25, 30, because residences became available, residential accommodation became. So all this led to creation of consumption demand for investment goods. And when that happened, then it created employment. Money went into people's pockets and they started spending. So that led to demand for consumer goods. So consumption demand or demand in the economy was sequenced in this particular way. I see no evidence of that in this year's budget or in the government's thinking generally.
Mm-hmm. In your book, Confessions of a Swadeshi Reformer, you kind of, detailed out the the foundation of reforms and what you did. So is there any link to what you did or what you saw at that time with what is happening now in terms of reform?
You see, reform, as you and I are aware, is a continuous process. I had challenges in my time, and I looked at economic reforms in the light of those challenges. The context has undergone a change, but the challenges, maybe of a different kind, remain. And therefore, those challenges have to be met by the budget, through the budget, or through other government action. So reforms will have to be done on a continuous basis. And the nature of reforms might undergo a change. Well, in this budget, there is some reference to that. But again, I'll say it is not holistic. It does not meet all the challenges.
But
and if you look at the 7-8 year government, then except for 3-4 important reforms that they have done, they have not touched every sector of the economy. I can draw satisfaction from the fact that in my time, I tried to touch every sector of the economy through some reform measure or the other.
Right. But in some ways, don't you think every budget is kind of incomplete because you can't do everything in one budget?
No, of course, you can't do everything. But as long as you take into account and deal with the current challenges, nobody knows what the challenge will be in, let's say, October of 22. I can't predict, you can't predict. So that will have to be met as we come face to face with it. But we are aware, and I listed those 7 challenges which are there before us. How will this generate employment? I mean, there's a very major crisis that we are facing. Do you think an increase of 2.5 lakh crore of rupees in capital expenditure will be able to meet the challenge of unemployment in our economy?
Do you agree with the headline numbers that the budget has given in terms of GDP growth forecast and fiscal deficit numbers?
Well, fiscal deficit, again, one looks at the detail of the budget as far as numbers are concerned. Now, how are you dealing with numbers in a budget? I mean, last year, they had a disinvestment target of 1,75,000 crore. Now, then what happened? You wanted to fix the fiscal deficit, let's say, at a certain level, 6.8. So you looked at your expenditure, you looked at your receipts, and then you found that there was a huge gap. So what do? You say, okay, put a certain figure on disinvestment, 1,75,000 crore. And then you realize you can't, there is no way in which you can realize it. So now you have pared it down to what, 66,000, or it is next year's target of in the budget. Now, this kind of budget making is highly objectionable.
That was my next question, disinvestment, because you kind of, you mentioned disinvestment in your first budget, I think, and, then it was carried forward by others also. So, right now, what is your sense of disinvestment, the way it is happening currently?
My take on disinvestment is that we should not look at disinvestment or privatization as an end in itself. There must be a disinvestment privatization policy. I had defined this policy in my 2001 budget. And I had clearly said, for instance, that loss-making public sector undertakings will be privatized. Then I had said that strategic sector industries will remain under government control, that we will not disinvest beyond 51% in certain sectors, etc. So point I'm making is there must be a disinvestment policy. There must be a privatization policy. Where is this policy in the last 7-8 years? This government has not come out with a policy. That's point number one. Point number two is, okay, you are going for the IPO of the LIC. LIC is a huge public sector undertaking. And if you go for IPO, then the response will be tremendous. And the day the IPO of LIC is done, government will end up receiving in its coffers large sums of money. So 1,75,000 crore, for instance, in the current year's budget might have been achievable if the LIC disinvestment or IPO had been done, but it has not been done. Will it be done next year? If it is done next year, then it might we might achieve the figure which has been budgeted. But if there are issues, then we can't. Then the other point which I'd like to make is,
I think government is saying that they'll do it this year itself.
Okay, so let's wait and see whether they are able to do it this year. If they are able to do it this year, then this figure of 1,75,000 crore need not have been revised. LIC disinvestment through IPO will get us a substantial sum of money. So, and gradually, the good public sector undertakings where you have, what shall I say, you have expectations of high receipts, that is also shrinking, isn't it? It's not that it's a limitless list. You can just go on drawing. That's also shrinking over time.
Right. So since we are talking about disinvestment and, sale of government assets, what are your thoughts on Air India? The sale has already happened, but would you have done it?
No, I was very keen to do it in my time. There were certain issues with the Minister for Civil Aviation in those days, and it couldn't happen. But we were very keen to do disinvestment of Air India. I'm very happy that finally, after a lapse of so many years, it has been done. Though the receipts are, 30,000 crore or something, which is not very much. Because Air India was saddled with, huge debt and other liabilities.
Right. So Mr. P. Chidambaram has called this budget a capitalist budget. Do you agree with that?
I don't know what he meant by saying it's a capitalist budget. To my mind, every budget is partly capitalist, partly people-oriented, partly growth-oriented. Mm-hmm. So, if he meant that it deals only with the capitalists in the country and not so much with the people, then he'll have to justify this.
I think he's also talking about similar aspects that you mentioned, that employment hasn't been focused on. So it should have been employment focused and not so much capital intensive.
There I will agree with him that it should have been focus on employment. As I said, I would have liked to see that sequencing of investment and demand that I mentioned to you earlier.
How, if you had to rate this budget, how would you rate it on 10? How many marks would you give it?
I have never given marks to my own budgets or to anyone else's budgets, because I think it's not very fair to give those marks. I like to tell you that every finance minister tries to do his or her best in meeting the challenges and putting together a budget. It's a very, very difficult task because you have to reconcile so many contradictions. And the success of a budget depends on how well you have been able to reconcile those contradictions or subdue those contradictions. At the end of the day, this is what will count. But I'll make another point to you. Mm-hmm. In the budget, we have a column as far as expenditure is concerned, or receipts. You have a column of actuals, you have a column of BE, you have a column of revised, and then you have a column of BE of the next year, isn't it?
Yes.
And we don't look at, I found that nobody compares the actuals with the budgeted of just 2 years ago. And we are not so much bothered also about the revised estimates. And look at one figure I'll give you, Manrega.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we are all aware of the fact that it has been drastically reduced compared to the revised estimates. Why? What is the justification for that? There is no, because are we saying that employment will be generated in such a fashion that people will not be required to work on Manrega? We know that there is distress in our economy, that MSMEs are in distress. Large number of people have got unemployed in the MSME sector, and they've all gone back to their villages. You have not forgotten those scenes of people walking back to their villages. And what is sustaining them? What is sustaining them is the employment guarantee program. Now you reduce the budget there, and there is a backlog of dues to the estates. So if out of this you pay that backlog, then what will be left in the next year for carrying on Manrega works or providing employment to people in distress? So this is just one example of how unemployment has not received the kind of attention it should have.
My last question to you is, do you think this budget is going to get BJP votes in the upcoming elections?
I'll tell you an experience, a personal experience. 4 or 5 years ago, on budget day, I was involved in a Kisan Andolan, Kisan movement in Madhya Pradesh, right? So budget was being presented on 1st February. I think it was Arun Jaitley was reading the budget speech. So I stayed on in my place of stay and listened to the budget speech. Okay, nobody else around me was interested. I listened to it because I was interested. Then I went out. Nobody said a word about the budget. Then we had a protest demonstration in the town. We went to the collector's office. Nobody was bothered. People went about their business. The farmer was in his field. The worker was working in his industry. The unemployed were ruining their fate wherever they were. Nobody was listening to the budget. The next day, the budget was carried in the newspapers. 2 days later, it was all gone. And therefore, I tweeted on the budget day that the shelf life of a budget is 24 hours. After that, you go back to whatever was your preoccupation.
So in some ways, it really doesn't matter whether a budget is populist or no, in terms of catching votes.
No. I think, suppose the government, much is being said about the fact, much credit is being given to the finance minister that she has not gone for a populist budget despite elections. Even if she had, it wouldn't have made any difference on the ground, because any populist budget is not going to deliver anything on the ground unless you say that over the next 15 days, we are going to give doles of whatever amount of money to every individual in this country.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sinha, for speaking to us. It was a pleasure.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.